A desperate mother rushes her feverish son to a clinic, only to be met with cold indifference and prejudice from the staff. Turned away and dismissed, she fights against time to save her child. But the clinic had no idea who they were dealing with, and now they're about to pay the price. Subscribe for more stories like this, and tell us, where are you watching from? Lauren adjusted the blanket around Elijah, her 2-year-old son, as he lay motionless on the couch. His normally bright brown eyes were dull, and his skin, usually warm with energy, felt clammy. She pressed her hand against his forehead. It was burning hot. Panic tugged at her thoughts. He had been fine just that morning, playing with his toys and babbling his favorite words. Now, something was clearly wrong. She rushed to the kitchen, grabbed the thermometer, and returned to Elijah. His little body squirmed weakly as she tried to take his temperature. When the device beeped, the reading flashed: 104.2 degrees Fahrenheit, 40.1 degrees Celsius. Lauren's heart sank. His fever had spiked dangerously fast. "Stay calm," she whispered to herself, though her hands trembled. She had dealt with fevers before, but this was different. Elijah wasn't just hot, he was lethargic, hardly responding to her voice. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. Lauren gave him some children's fever medicine, hoping it would buy them time, but she knew it wasn't enough. The nearest emergency room was too far, and she didn't want to waste time. They needed immediate medical attention. She scooped Elijah into her arms, cradling his limp body as he leaned heavily against her. His head lolled onto her shoulder, making her anxiety spike. Without another thought, she grabbed her car keys and rushed out the door. The streets were quiet, the orange glow of street lights illuminating the late evening sky as Lauren drove through her neighborhood. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. "Hold on, baby. Just a little longer," she whispered, glancing at Elijah in the rearview mirror. He lay slumped in his car seat, his eyes half-lidded, barely conscious. Every mile felt like an eternity. Her mind raced with terrible scenarios. What if it was something serious? What if they didn't make it in time? "Stop it," she muttered, trying to fight off the spiraling thoughts. She needed to focus. Elijah needed her to be calm. Lauren arrived at the private clinic, the one known for quick service and exceptional care. She parked haphazardly, not caring that the car was slightly crooked. As she unbuckled Elijah from his seat, her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. His body was too warm, and his breathing seemed heavier than before. She burst through the clinic doors, Elijah in her arms, her eyes scanning for help. The front desk was manned by a young man with a name tag that read Brian. His disinterested expression shifted to annoyance the moment he noticed her. "I need help. My son, he's burning up. He's not responding. Please, I need a doctor," Lauren said, breathless and desperate. Brian barely glanced at Elijah. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, Please, this is an emergency." He gave her a condescending look, his eyes trailing over her disheveled appearance, her hastily thrown-on hoodie, the sweatpants, and the panic on her face. "We're busy. You'll have to wait." "Wait? He's really sick." Lauren's voice cracked, a mix of fear and frustration bubbling to the surface. Brian sighed theatrically. "I'll need your insurance information before we can do anything." She fumbled with her wallet, trying to keep Elijah balanced in one arm. Brian gave a bored glance at the insurance card she handed over. "This insurance might not cover our services," he muttered, making no effort to hide his skepticism. "These things get expensive." Lauren's chest tightened. The implication was clear. He didn't think she could afford the care her son needed. She swallowed hard, her emotions swirling between humiliation and rage. "I don't care how much it costs," she said firmly. "Just help my son." Brian raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You'll still need to wait. We're short-staffed." Lauren felt a lump form in her throat. Every second wasted felt like a step closer to losing Elijah. She fought back tears, determined not to give Brian the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling with desperation. Brian exhaled loudly and rolled his eyes. "Fine. Sit over there. I'll see if anyone's available." Lauren clenched her jaw but forced herself to sit down, holding Elijah close. His breathing was shallow, and his small hands were limp against her chest. She kissed his forehead, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. She wanted to scream at the indifference around her, but she knew it wouldn't help. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a nurse called them to the back. A pediatrician finally arrived, his expression impatient as if he were doing them a favor by showing up. Lauren explained Elijah's symptoms, her voice rushed and filled with fear. The doctor gave a cursory glance at Elijah, feeling his forehead and listening to his breathing with an air of disinterest. "It's probably just a virus," he muttered. "Children get these all the time, nothing to worry about." Lauren's frustration boiled over. "Nothing to worry about? He's burning up. He won't respond to me." The doctor waved off her concerns. "We'll monitor him for a bit, but it's likely just a cold. Kids bounce back quickly." Lauren's stomach churned with unease, but she knew arguing wouldn't get her anywhere. She was trapped between the need to fight for her son and the helplessness of being dismissed. They left the room, and as she passed Brian on the way out, she caught the smug smirk on his face. It was a look that said he didn't think they belonged there, like he was waiting for them to leave and never come back. Lauren's heart ached with the weight of humiliation and fear. She knew they had to find real help, and fast. Elijah's life depended on it. Lauren sat silently in the back seat of the car, holding Elijah close as Mark drove them home. The cool air from the vents did little to ease her rising panic. Elijah's skin was still burning hot, and his breathing was shallow. The memory of the pediatrician's dismissive attitude gnawed at her. She had begged for more tests, but the doctor had refused. He didn't even seem to care. His eyes had been indifferent, his tone flat, as though Elijah's condition was no more concerning than a mild cough. Lauren kept replaying the words in her mind. "It's just a cold. There's no need for extra tests." She wanted to believe him, but something in her gut told her otherwise. They arrived home, and Lauren laid Elijah gently on the couch, brushing a damp curl from his forehead. His small chest rose and fell, but each breath seemed too shallow, too labored. His once vibrant eyes remained half-closed, glazed over with fever. Lauren tried to distract herself by checking his temperature again. 104 degrees Fahrenheit. It hadn't gone down at all. She tried to convince herself it was just anxiety. She was a new mother, after all. Maybe she was overreacting. But no matter how hard she tried, the gnawing fear in her chest refused to leave. Something wasn't right, and deep down, she knew it. Hours passed, and Elijah's condition did not improve. Lauren sat by his side, holding his small hand, her heart heavy with fear. Each time his little body stirred, she whispered soothing words, though her voice trembled with every breath. As the night stretched on, Lauren became increasingly restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had been dismissed because of who they were, because of the color of their skin. A moment from the clinic replayed in her mind. The way Brian had sneered at her insurance card, the doctor's dismissive glance, the exchange of smug smiles between the two men as she left the exam room. Her chest tightened with anger and helplessness. Would they have treated me like this if I looked different? If Elijah had lighter skin? She wondered bitterly. Lauren paced the room, biting her nails and checking on Elijah every few minutes. His condition was unchanged. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. It felt like they were running out of time. She couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Mark's number. Mark answered on the second ring. His voice was calm, but Lauren could sense the tension beneath it. "Lauren, what's wrong?" "It's Elijah," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's not getting any better. His fever, it's still so high. I don't know what to do." Mark was silent for a moment, processing her words. Then she heard the unmistakable rustle of papers and the scraping of a chair. He was leaving his meeting. "I'm coming home," he said firmly. "Stay with him. I'll be there soon." Lauren exhaled, relieved. Mark always knew what to do. If anyone could make things right, it was him. It didn't take long for Mark to arrive. He burst through the front door, his tie askew and his suit jacket crumpled from the hurried drive home. He took one look at Elijah, and his face hardened with determination. "We're going to the hospital," Mark said without hesitation. "Now." Lauren nodded, scooping Elijah into her arms. She could feel the tension in Mark's movements as he gathered their things. His jaw was clenched, his usual calm demeanor replaced by an edge of urgency. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get him the help he needs, I promise." They drove through the empty streets, the city lights flickering past in a blur. Mark's hands gripped the steering wheel with a steady focus, but Lauren could see the worry etched into his features. He glanced back at Elijah every few minutes, his expression darkening with each glance. Lauren reached over, placing a hand on Mark's arm. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she whispered. "You don't have to thank me," Mark replied, his voice tight. "He's our son. I should have been there sooner." Lauren knew he carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He always did. But this time she didn't let him bear it alone. As they neared the hospital, Lauren's heart raced with equal parts fear and hope. This time, she told herself, they would find someone who cared. They wouldn't let Elijah slip through the cracks. Not again. The car came to a smooth stop outside the hospital entrance. Mark jumped out and ran around to help Lauren with Elijah, his movements quick and purposeful. They stepped through the hospital's automatic doors, and everything seemed to move in slow motion. The blinding fluorescent lights, the distant sound of medical equipment, and the faint hum of voices. A nurse at the reception desk immediately noticed them and hurried over, her expression concerned. "What's wrong?" "It's our son," Mark said, his voice steady but urgent. "He's burning up. He needs help." The nurse took one look at Elijah and nodded. "Follow me. We'll take care of him." Lauren felt a wave of relief crash over her. At last, someone was listening. Back at home, Lauren sat beside Elijah's crib, watching over him with relentless vigilance. The nurse at the second hospital had reassured them that they would take care of everything, but Lauren's heart remained heavy. She had tried to give Elijah some water, but he barely stirred. His shallow breathing filled the room, each soft breath like a reminder of her helplessness. She checked his temperature again, 104.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It was rising, not falling. The medicine was doing nothing. "Elijah, baby, stay with me," she whispered, stroking his damp forehead. Suddenly, he let out a soft moan, his tiny body twitching. Panic surged through her as she realized his breathing had become uneven. Sharp gasps followed by troubling silence. His chest shuddered with each breath, as if even the act of inhaling was too much for him. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She pressed her ear to his small chest, hoping, praying, that his heartbeat would offer some rhythm of reassurance. But it was too fast, frantic, and weak. Lauren knew they couldn't afford to wait another moment. "Elijah? Can you hear me, baby?" she whispered, desperate for any response. His eyes fluttered open briefly, but there was no recognition in them. He whimpered faintly, and her heart broke a little more. She rushed to her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled to Mark's number. Mark answered immediately. "What's happening?" Lauren's voice wavered. "He's worse, Mark. His breathing, it's like he's struggling." "I'm on my way," Mark replied firmly. She could hear the rustle of papers in the background, his quick footsteps echoing through the phone. He didn't wait for her to say more before hanging up, leaving Lauren alone with her spiraling thoughts. She returned to Elijah's side, cradling him gently. Every second felt like an eternity, her mind filled with the worst-case scenarios. 15 minutes later, Mark burst through the front door. His usual calm and collected demeanor was gone, replaced by raw fear and urgency. He rushed to Lauren's side and crouched next to her. "Elijah?" Mark's voice cracked as he touched their son's fevered forehead. "We need to leave now," Mark said, helping Lauren to her feet. "We're not waiting another second." Lauren nodded, clutching Elijah against her chest as Mark grabbed the car keys. They moved quickly, the urgency in their steps fueled by pure instinct. The drive to the new hospital felt agonizingly slow, even though Mark sped through every green light and empty street. Lauren sat in the back seat with Elijah cradled in her arms, her heart pounding in sync with the engine's hum. She could feel Elijah's shallow breaths against her skin, each one more labored than the last. "Stay with me, baby," Lauren whispered, pressing her cheek against his head. Mark's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror every few seconds. He was trying to stay focused, but Lauren knew he was just as terrified as she was. When they arrived at the hospital, Mark jumped out and ran around the car to open Lauren's door. Together, they hurried inside, Elijah limp in Lauren's arms. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency room cast a harsh glare, but Lauren didn't care. All she wanted was for someone, anyone, to help her baby. A nurse saw them immediately and waved them over. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes widening at the sight of Elijah. "He has a high fever, 104.5, Lauren said, her voice choked with fear. "He can't breathe properly." "Follow me," the nurse said urgently, leading them down a hallway toward the pediatric emergency area. The medical team sprang into action the moment they entered the room. A doctor and 2 nurses took Elijah from Lauren's arms, placing him gently on a gurney. "We're going to take care of him," the doctor assured them, though Lauren could barely hear his words over the rushing sound of her heartbeat. They worked quickly. Oxygen mask, IV lines, and blood draws happening in a blur of coordinated movement. Lauren and Mark stood at the edge of the room, helpless spectators in the fight for their son's life. One of the nurses turned to them. "We'll need to run several tests. It might take some time, but you're in the right place now." Lauren gripped Mark's hand, her fingers digging into his skin. He squeezed back, offering silent support, though his expression remained tense and unreadable. They waited in excruciating silence. Every beep of the heart monitor felt like a lifeline, tethering them to hope. Hours later, the doctor returned, his expression somber but determined. We've confirmed it. Your son has bacterial meningitis. It's serious, but we've caught it just in time. He'll need to stay in the ICU for monitoring and treatment." Lauren's knees nearly gave out, but Mark caught her, holding her steady. "He's going to be okay," the doctor continued, "but it's good you brought him in when you did." Lauren's relief was mixed with fury. If only the first clinic had taken us seriously. Back in the waiting area, Mark paced the floor while Lauren sat slumped in a plastic chair, her hands clasped tightly together. She stared blankly at the floor, her mind replaying the events of the past day, the sneering face of the receptionist, the indifferent glance of the pediatrician, the laughter behind her back. Mark stopped pacing and knelt beside her. "We won't let this slide, Lauren," he said softly but firmly. "They almost cost us our son's life." Lauren looked into his eyes and saw the same anger and resolve that burned within her. She nodded, grateful for his strength. "They're going to pay for what they did," Mark promised. "No one should ever go through this." The tension in the room slowly lifted as a nurse approached them with an update. "Your son is stable for now. We'll keep him in the ICU, but he's responding well to the treatment." Tears welled in Lauren's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. The nurse smiled warmly. "You did the right thing, bringing him here." As the nurse walked away, Lauren turned to Mark. "We have to make sure this never happens to anyone else," she said quietly. Mark nodded. "And we will, I promise." Lauren and Mark sat in the dimly lit ICU room, their eyes glued to Elijah, who lay in the small hospital bed with tubes and wires connected to his fragile body. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor provided a haunting soundtrack to their thoughts, but at least it was steady, for now. The sight of their little boy, barely clinging to life, filled Lauren with a mixture of fear, anger, and overwhelming exhaustion. Mark rested his hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. "He's in the right place now," he whispered, but Lauren could still feel the weight of the encounter at the first clinic pressing heavily on her chest. It wasn't just the dismissal or the rudeness. It was the realization that Elijah's life had been placed in jeopardy because of someone else's prejudice. Doctors came and went, checking on Elijah's vitals and administering antibiotics to combat the bacterial infection ravaging his body. Lauren clung to every word they said, but the medical jargon blurred into white noise. Hours stretched into the early morning, and the exhaustion from the emotional roller coaster began to catch up with her. Mark stepped out briefly to call family members, updating them on Elijah's condition. Lauren sat alone with her son, gently stroking his small hand, her mind flashing back to the clinic and the cold indifference she had faced. She gritted her teeth, rage bubbling up inside her. They almost killed him. If she had listened to the doctor who dismissed Elijah's symptoms, her son wouldn't be lying here now, alive but fragile. She knew with certainty that the only reason they were treated that way was because of their skin color. Mark returned, looking pale and tense. He slumped into the chair beside her, running a hand down his face. "Our boy's tough. He's gonna pull through," he whispered, more to convince himself than her. Lauren gave him a small, tired nod, but her anger was sharper now. "Mark, they have to answer for this." "I know," Mark said grimly, "and they will." He wasn't just saying it to calm her down. As a man with influence in the healthcare system, Mark had the power to initiate investigations, and he was prepared to do exactly that. His jaw clenched as he imagined the consequences that awaited the clinic staff. The people who dismissed them would regret their negligence. "We're not just going to hold them accountable for Elijah," Lauren said, her voice thick with emotion. "We need to make sure no one else has to go through this." Mark nodded, his eyes dark with determination. "We'll make sure of it." Hours passed, but every minute felt agonizingly slow. Lauren and Mark took turns sitting by Elijah's side, watching for any small signs of improvement. Finally, a nurse came in with a clipboard and offered them an update. "His condition is stabilizing," the nurse said with a warm smile. "The antibiotics are working and his fever is starting to come down. He's not out of the woods yet, but this is a good sign." Lauren let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping Mark's hand tightly. The nurse gave them a reassuring nod before leaving the room, allowing them a moment to absorb the good news. Mark exhaled, his shoulders sagging with relief. "He's going to make it," he whispered, almost as if he didn't believe it himself. Lauren wiped her eyes, but the rage simmering beneath her relief hadn't disappeared. "We can't let this go, Mark," she said again. "What if we had waited? What if we listened to that doctor?" "We won't let it go," Mark promised. "I'll contact the board first thing tomorrow. We're going to get answers." The morning light began to creep through the windows, casting a soft glow over the hospital room. Lauren watched as Elijah's breathing became more regular, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The tension in her body began to loosen, but the memories of the previous night stayed with her. "We have to make sure this doesn't happen again," Lauren whispered. "Not to anyone." Mark leaned in and kissed her forehead. "We will," he said firmly. "We'll make sure they're held accountable." Together, they sat in silence, waiting for the next update from the doctors, but Lauren knew that once Elijah was out of danger, the real battle would begin. When the doctor returned a few hours later, his face was calm and reassuring. "Your son is responding well to the treatment," he said. "If he continues improving, we'll move him out of the ICU by tomorrow." Lauren exhaled a long breath, feeling like she could finally breathe again. For the first time in what felt like days, she smiled. Mark wrapped an arm around her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We made it," he whispered, but Lauren's mind was already moving to the next step. "When Elijah is stable, we're going after them," she said quietly, her voice steady with resolve. Mark nodded. "I'll start making calls as soon as we get him home." The hours that followed were a blur of cautious optimism. Nurses came and went, checking Elijah's vitals and administering medication. Lauren and Mark stayed at his side the entire time, never leaving him for more than a few minutes. By the time night fell again, Elijah's fever had finally broken. His tiny body, which had been so limp and unresponsive, now twitched with signs of life. His small fingers curled around Lauren's hand, and she felt tears sting her eyes once more. "Hey, baby," she whispered, brushing his curls away from his forehead. "You're going to be okay." Mark sat beside her, watching his son with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We're going to fix this, Lauren," he said. "We're going to make sure this never happens again." Lauren squeezed his hand, her heart filled with both gratitude and fury. They had made it through the night, but the fight was far from over. The sun was barely up when Mark stepped out of the hospital room, phone in hand, ready to set things in motion. Elijah's condition had stabilized overnight, and though relief filled his heart, anger fueled his next steps. It wasn't just about Elijah. It was about ensuring no other family ever faced the same disregard and prejudice. He scrolled through his contacts, quickly dialing a number. The call connected after 2 rings. "This is Mark Hamilton. he said, his voice low but firm. "I need you to initiate a formal investigation into the Crescent Avenue Clinic. Today." The person on the other end stammered in response, but Mark didn't give them a chance to object. "We have documented negligence and evidence of discrimination. I want every record reviewed, and I want answers fast." Meanwhile, back in the hospital room, Lauren sat by Elijah's bedside, still processing the roller coaster of emotions. She knew Mark was already working to hold the clinic accountable, and she trusted him, but part of her still felt the sting of helplessness from the night before. A nurse entered the room with a kind smile, checking Elijah's vitals. "He's doing really well," she said, adjusting the IV drip. "You brought him here just in time." Lauren gave a grateful nod, though the nurse's words only reignited her anger. Just in time. They had almost lost their son because the first clinic dismissed them. Mark returned a short while later, his expression set with grim determination. "They're opening a formal investigation," he told Lauren, pulling up a chair beside her. "I've already spoken to the health board. We're going to get to the bottom of this." Lauren exhaled, her grip on Elijah's hand relaxing slightly. "Good. They need to answer for what they did." "They will," Mark assured her, "and I want more than just apologies. I want reforms. I want policies in place to prevent this from happening again." Lauren nodded, her resolve matching his. "We can't stop until they're held accountable. Not just the people who ignored us, but the entire system." The investigation moved quickly under Mark's influence. Within days, disturbing patterns began to emerge from the Crescent Avenue Clinic's records. Mark sat in his office, poring over documents with grim satisfaction. As expected, Brian, the receptionist, had a history of complaints against him, primarily from black patients. His dismissive behavior wasn't a one-time incident. It was a pattern of prejudice. Further digging uncovered that the pediatrician who had seen Elijah was known for downplaying the concerns of minority parents. Several patients had complained about his lack of care and condescending attitude, but the clinic had ignored the reports, choosing to protect its staff instead of addressing the systemic bias. Mark called Lauren from his office, updating her on the findings. "It's worse than we thought," he said, his voice heavy with anger. "Brian has a long history of turning away black patients. And the doctor? He's been dismissing serious cases for years. They've just been covering it up." Lauren's stomach churned with rage. "We need to make this public, Mark. People need to know what's been happening." "We will," Mark promised. "But first, we're going to make sure the board takes action. I want them fired, and I want policies changed so this never happens again." Later that evening, Mark and Lauren sat together in the hospital, watching Elijah sleep. His small chest rose and fell steadily, a reassuring sight after everything they had been through. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "Once Elijah is discharged, we'll go to the clinic ourselves. I want to see their faces when they realize what's coming." Lauren gave him a tired but determined smile. "They won't know what hit them." The next morning, Mark's phone buzzed with a call from the health board. The investigation had uncovered enough evidence to warrant immediate action. Brian and the pediatrician were suspended pending further review, and the clinic was ordered to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation. Mark shared the news with Lauren as they sat by Elijah's bedside. "They're starting to take it seriously," he said, though there was no triumph in his voice, only grim resolve. "They better," Lauren muttered, her jaw clenched. "This isn't just about us. It's about every family they've treated like we didn't matter." Lauren and Mark knew they were only at the beginning of a long battle, But they were ready. They had each other, they had their son, and they had the truth on their side. Mark looked over at Lauren, his expression softening for the first time in days. "We're going to make this right," he said quietly. Lauren nodded, her hand resting gently on Elijah's tiny chest. "We will, and we won't stop until it's done." Lauren and Mark arrived at the Crescent Avenue Clinic early in the morning, the air heavy with anticipation. Elijah had been discharged from the hospital the day before, finally recovering from the harrowing ordeal. They left him in the care of Lauren's sister for the morning, knowing they had a mission to accomplish today. Mark straightened his tie and cast a glance at Lauren, who wore an expression of unyielding determination. She had dressed sharply in a blazer, her posture radiating quiet strength. This wasn't just a personal visit. It was a confrontation. They were here to demand justice. Inside the clinic, Brian was at the front desk, oblivious to the storm about to hit. His usual condescending smirk was firmly in place as he half-heartedly greeted them. "Back again?" he sneered, clearly not recognizing them at first. Lauren's gaze was icy. "Yes, we are, and we need to speak to your administrator, now." Brian blinked, his smirk faltering as recognition dawned on him. The smug expression he had worn so comfortably disappeared in an instant. One moment," he muttered, fumbling with the phone on his desk. Mark folded his arms, standing tall and silent beside Lauren, exuding authority. Brian squirmed under his gaze as the weight of his negligence began to settle in. The administrator, a middle-aged woman with an air of nervous professionalism, soon appeared in the lobby. She introduced herself as Miss Caldwell and tried to diffuse the tension with a polite but forced smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton, I've been informed of your concerns. Please, let's discuss this in my office," she said, gesturing toward the hallway. Mark gave a curt nod, and they followed her into a small, glass-walled office. The administrator shut the door behind them and motioned for them to sit. "First, let me say how deeply sorry we are for your experience. We take these matters very seriously," Miss Caldwell began. Lauren didn't wait for pleasantries. "My son almost died because of the negligence of your staff. Your receptionist refused to help us, and your pediatrician dismissed serious symptoms as a cold. They both need to be held accountable." Miss Caldwell's smile faltered. "I understand your frustration, Mrs. Hamilton. I assure you we're conducting an internal review." "That's not enough," Mark interrupted, his voice cold and steady. "We don't want internal reviews. We want real consequences, and we want systemic changes." The administrator shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught off guard by their directness. "We are prepared to offer you compensation," she said carefully. "And of course, a formal apology." Lauren leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Compensation won't undo the damage your staff caused. If we hadn't gone to another hospital, our son would be dead. An apology isn't enough." Miss Caldwell hesitated, clearly unprepared for this level of confrontation. "We're taking corrective action," she said weakly. "The staff involved are on temporary suspension." Mark's gaze darkened. Temporary suspension isn't justice. We want them permanently removed. And we want reforms, mandatory racial sensitivity training, better protocols for emergency cases, and public accountability. The administrator's attempt to downplay the situation crumbled under their unrelenting demands. She knew they couldn't afford a public scandal. The clinic's reputation was already fragile after the investigation Mark had initiated with the health board. After a long, tense silence, Miss Caldwell nodded reluctantly. "We'll make the necessary changes," The staff members involved will be terminated, and I'll personally oversee the implementation of new policies." Mark leaned back slightly, his expression unwavering. "Good. We also expect a public statement acknowledging the harm caused by this incident." Miss Caldwell gave a resigned nod, her shoulders sagging. "It will be done." The meeting ended on a grim note of victory. Mark and Lauren had achieved what they came for: the firing of Brian and the negligent pediatrician, along with the promise of institutional reform. But the weight of what they had gone through still lingered heavily in the air. As they stepped out of the office and made their way through the lobby, Brian avoided their eyes, his face pale and tight with fear. His smugness had vanished, replaced by the realization that his actions had real consequences. Lauren cast him one last cold glance before stepping out into the fresh morning air. They stood outside the clinic, the sunlight warm on their skin. Lauren exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease ever so slightly. "It's done," Mark said quietly. "They won't get away with it." Lauren nodded, though a part of her still ached from the experience. "We made sure no one else will go through this. That's what matters." Mark wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "We did what we had to do, and Elijah's safe now." Lauren leaned into him, grateful for his strength and for the knowledge that they had fought for their son, and for other families who might face the same prejudice. The house was finally quiet as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting soft orange light across the living room. Lauren sat on the floor, watching Elijah play with his favorite stuffed animal, his small hands clutching it tightly as he babbled happily. The sight filled her with overwhelming relief. After days of fear, hospital visits, and confrontations, they were home. Elijah was safe, and life was beginning to settle again. But even now, the weight of everything they had endured lingered in the back of Lauren's mind. Mark sat on the couch behind her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "He's looking good," he said softly, a tired smile spreading across his face as he watched their son play. Lauren nodded. "Yeah, I was so scared, Mark," she whispered. "I kept thinking we'd lose him." Mark reached out, brushing his hand against hers. "We didn't. He's here. And because of us, no one else will have to go through what we did." The public statement from the Crescent Avenue Clinic had come earlier that afternoon, an official apology, along with the announcement of new policies. Brian and the pediatrician had been dismissed, and the clinic had committed to racial sensitivity training for all staff. Lauren and Mark had also received private letters of apology from the clinic's management, but it wasn't the words that mattered to them. What mattered was knowing that something had changed. "Do you think it'll really make a difference?" Lauren asked, resting her head against Mark's shoulder. "It will," Mark replied confidently, "and we're going to make sure of it. That's not the end of this fight." Mark had already begun drafting the framework for a new public initiative, an organization aimed at supporting families who faced medical discrimination. It would offer legal assistance, resources for reporting bias, and public campaigns to raise awareness. "We'll help other families," Mark said, his eyes filled with determination. "What happened to us wasn't unique. But we can make sure people know they're not alone and that they have power." Lauren smiled at him, her heart swelling with pride. "You're amazing, you know that?" Mark chuckled. "I'm just following your lead." A peaceful silence fell between them as they sat together, watching Elijah crawl across the room, giggling as he toppled his toy blocks. The sight was ordinary, but after everything they had gone through, it felt extraordinary. Lauren felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for Elijah's recovery, but for the strength they had found within themselves. They had stood up against injustice, fought for their son, and forced change in a system that had tried to ignore them. "We're going to be okay," Lauren whispered, more to herself than to Mark. "We are," Mark agreed, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "No matter what comes next, we'll handle it. Together." In the quiet of the evening, Lauren allowed herself a rare moment of peace. She watched Elijah stack his blocks, laughing each time they toppled over, his joyful noise filling the room like music. Mark kissed her temple. "We did good, Lauren." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yeah, we did." The next morning, they woke up to a fresh start. Life didn't stop. There were still bills to pay, meals to cook, and errands to run, but it all felt lighter now. They had faced one of the hardest challenges of their lives and come out stronger on the other side. Mark poured coffee while Lauren helped Elijah into his high chair. The ordinary rhythm of their morning felt like a small victory. As they sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and feeding Elijah his breakfast, Lauren knew they had crossed a threshold. They were not just parents. They were fighters, advocates, and a family that wouldn't be silenced or ignored. Mark glanced across the table at Lauren. "Ready to change the world?" he asked with a grin. Lauren laughed softly, one step at a time. Mark leaned forward, clasping her hand. "We've got this. Whatever comes next, we're ready." Lauren squeezed his hand, her heart full. Elijah giggled from his high chair, oblivious to the challenges his parents had overcome. They had won this battle, and no matter what the future held, Lauren knew they would keep fighting. For Elijah, for each other, and for the families who needed them. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button so you're always the first to catch new stories. And if you enjoyed this one, we've got more waiting for you. Check out the next video or explore others on our channel. Every click helps us bring you even more powerful stories. See you in the next one.